So a few days ago, Joe Rogan came out with a pretty contentious claim on his podcast when he was talking about Ukraine and the Russian war. Instead of me explaining it, we'll let Joe explain it himself.
I feel safer knowing that Trump is in office.
I do too.
I feel great about it.
First of all, I don't understand when people are saying that they feel safer all of a sudden now that Trump is in office. I guess I would understand it if everybody was somehow convinced of Trump's weird lie about how there was no wars under his presidency and everything was peace and calm in the world, which if you even just have a cursory glance at the past and during his presidency, it's obviously not true. Did he or did he not kill Soleimani in an airport, with a missile strike? Were bombings still happening in Syria? I mean, they were, just Trump blocked people from reporting it, so we just didn't hear as much about it. We had the Great March of Return in Palestine with Israel. One of the most annoying things about a lot of these claims, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but instead of that, it's just an alternate fact that they just repeat so often that they've heard from somebody that it becomes truth in their own mind.
What I don't feel safer is right now they're launching missiles into Russia.
Yeah.
How are you allowed to do that when you're on the way out? Like, the people don't want you to be there anymore. There should be like some sort of a pause for like significant actions that could potentially start World War III. Maybe that would be a good thing that we would like to avoid from a dying former president.
Here, real quick news flash for Joe Rogan. All right, listen, Joe, you dipshit. The president is the president until he's no longer the president anymore. So that means that Biden could do whatever the fuck he wants with the weapons that he's in control over. I'm just going to let you guys know something, and this is a secret. I need you guys to keep it as well. Now, I understand people like Joe not knowing it, but I'm hoping not many of you think this as well. But just in case, I'm just going to let you in on a little secret. Joe Biden is not the president of Ukraine. Now, again, I know this comes as a huge shock to a lot of you, but that's Zelensky. All the United States and Joe Biden did was say, hey, you know those weapons that we've given you? You know how they have a really long range, right? Well, now you can utilize that range. The thing is, they've had a lot of these weapons already. The only thing that they weren't allowed to do is fire them within Russian territory. And this is something that's been going on since the war started. So essentially, a lot of the weapons that the United States and other NATO allied countries have given Ukraine, there's rules and regulations on how they can use it. For example, the missile that they're talking about in this video is an ATACMS missile. Now, it's launched off the HIMARS system that the United States owns. We gave them a lot of these missiles, and we said, hey, you can use this in defense only on your own country. And the reason that we were able to put that stipulation in place is because in order for these weapons to work, they need confidential classified guidance information supplied by the United States Army. So even if Ukraine wanted to use a weapon deep inside of Russia, they wouldn't be able to use it because they wouldn't be able to get the targeting and data into the missile to let it hit the target effectively. The only thing that the United States did differently, along with other NATO allies like France, Germany, and the UK, officially gave the green light to attack in Russian territory. Unlike the Russians, who have been doing it since day one of the war, I mean, here's a couple pieces of video evidence proving that. What they're doing is they're saying, hey, if you're going to use this weapon to target Russians in Russia or North Koreans, if you're using this to target people inside Russia, what you're not allowed to do is go after anything that isn't a military target. So for example, if there's a bunker or a command post inside Russia, the United States will give them the coordinates and the information needed for them to fire that weapon. They're not allowed to just fire it at a population center with civilians. They're not allowed to fire it at hospitals or schools like the Russians do. So the fact that Joe is here trying to act like all of a sudden we're prompting World War III is pretty ridiculous, especially since we're only going after military targets. And one of the things I've always been curious about the people that are so opposed to the Ukrainians attacking Russians in Russian territories, I just have this one question. Can anybody give me a single example of an armed conflict where all of the fighting and the bombing and the killing was only allowed to take place in one of those countries and not the other? Especially since the Russians are the aggressor, but for some reason they're only allowed to bomb Ukrainian territory. That's just something I've never understood. It brings an imbalance to war that makes it almost impossible for Ukraine to win, which seems to be the goal of some of these people talking about it. But let's just keep going.
The whole thing is nuts.
I mean, look, I don't know shit about politics.
Zelensky says Putin is terrified.
At least this guy who Joe's talking to and is able to admit that, he doesn't know much about politics or he doesn't want to say much. I feel like that is something we're sorely missing in today's media sphere, is just that people willing to admit they might not know something, so they're not going to give a strong opinion on it. So apparently, Joe Rogan's response to Putin is terrified is to say fuck you to Joe Biden and Zelensky. Now, to remind everybody, Putin started this war. He's been the one that has been attacking civilian centers and hospital and energy infrastructure the entire time. If Putin was so terrified of all of this destruction, he could end this war in one day. He could end it by pulling out of Ukraine, taking all of his troops, and fucking off. Now, if he really was terrified, he would do that because he wouldn't want the repercussions of what would happen next. I don't think he is terrified. I think he's saying these things to put it out there to scare simple-minded people like Joe Rogan.
The whole thing is nuts.
I mean, look, I don't know shit about politics.
Zelensky says Putin is terrified. Fuck you, man. Fuck you people. You fucking people are about to start World War III.
How is Ukraine defending themselves? By attacking military targets in Russia, starting World War III, according to Joe, but the Russians invading in 2022 and in 2014 when they started isn't leading to World War III? Especially Joe, he's supposed to be a tough guy, right? I don't understand how he turned into such a quivering pussy at the feet of Vladimir Putin. Like, it blows my mind. What happened to American exceptionalism, especially with the right? We all know that Russians have been saber-rattling this entire conflict. I don't understand how these guys can claim to be tough in one hand, but quiver like a pussy whenever Putin says something like, oh, I'm scared, like, you better not do this, guys. It's fucking retarded. I don't understand how people like Joe Rogan and Dave Smith and all these other centrists and people on the right who are talking about this conflict keep falling for Putin's saber-rattling. Like, how many red lines has Putin, drawn in the sand saying, if you do this, you're going to lead to us having to use nukes in World War III? How many red lines have there been? Because there's been a couple. I was able to find some, so I'll read them out to you. He mentioned a red line if NATO supplied lethal aid. In 2022, the United States and the West supplied lethal aid to Ukraine. No nukes. NATO supplying long-range weapon systems. We supplied the Ukrainians with long-range weapon systems in 2022. Red line crossed, no nuclear war. Attacks on illegally annexed territory. Now that is territory like Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, basically anywhere where Russia is currently in and they annexed at the end of 2022 or 2023. And what happened after that? Ukraine bombed those areas with NATO-supplied weapons. No nuclear war, another red line crossed. Any attempt to retake Crimea. The Ukrainians have been trying to retake Crimea since the war started. Red line crossed, no nuclear war. Another red line that Putin brought up that said this could lead to World War III was any attack on the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Now, newsflash, 37% of the Russian Black Sea Fleet is now at the bottom of said Black Sea. And guess what? Another red line crossed and no nukes. All right, let's keep going. What else do we have? We have NATO supplying main battle tanks. Now, this one took a little bit. The war started in 2022. There was a little bit of a time where the United States and the West in general was contemplating whether or not to provide the Ukrainians with main battle tanks, such as the M1 Abrams in the United States or the Leopard tanks from Germany. Turns out, in 2023, we provided those tanks. The Ukrainians received training on the M1 Abrams, the Challenger, the Leopard, and along with other kind of fighting vehicles like the Bradley fighting vehicle from the United States. And again, no nukes launched and another red line crossed. So again, let's keep going. I just want to make sure that I give everybody as many examples just so you can shut the fuck up and stop being such a fucking pussy. I'm here to help. I'm here to help you. I promise. Another red line that Putin had was NATO supplying the Ukrainians with Patriot missile systems. This one I like because the Patriot missile system is a missile defense system. To my knowledge, it can't really be used in an offensive capability. Its main purpose is to track, detect, and destroy incoming ballistic missiles or any other type of rocket attacks that would come and hit Ukrainian cities. It's a completely defensive system, similar to how the Iron Dome system works in Israel. So I don't understand why Putin would be so upset at a defensive missile system. It seems that he doesn't like defensive actions against Russian aggression, but be that as it may, that was another red line that was crossed. Ukrainians have Patriot missile batteries now. They won a couple more. They've lost one or two of them so far, and they're just really effective at knocking down Russian cruise missiles, but another red line crossed, and still nothing from Putin, other than another red line right down the road. And the next one was attacks on Russian territory. Now this one is very interesting to me in particular just because it kind of shows Putin's hand a little bit. One of the stipulations that Ukraine had to follow in order to get aid from Western countries and NATO was that anything that was given to the Ukrainians for self-defense had to be used on Ukrainian territory, which at the beginning of the conflict was fine. Don't forget, in the beginning of the conflict, when they first started getting all these weapon systems and all these promises were made, the Russians were just outside of Kyiv. They were all the way inside of Western Ukraine, and it made sense to say, hey, you're allowed to use these weapons that NATO gives you in defense of your own land, but you can't use them to attack Russian land, which at the beginning of the conflict made sense. For a long time, that's what they were doing, until there was this massive counteroffensive that the Ukrainians were able to mount, which kicked the Russians several kilometers back towards the west, and the Ukrainians ended up taking cities like Kharkiv again. Even though that the Ukrainians pushed everyone back, and now that Kharkiv is only 20 miles away from the Russian border, the restrictions on them using NATO weapons only on Ukrainian soil still stood, which meant that Russia was simply able to just launch their drones and attack planes and launch artillery rounds from Russian soil, knowing that the Ukrainians weren't allowed to contact them. They knew that the Ukrainians couldn't hit an artillery piece if it was on Russian soil, so they just moved all the artillery pieces onto Russian soil and started bombing them anyway. Because a lot of these artillery pieces and weapon systems would be able to reach the areas of operation even though they were in Russian soil. So, Ukraine was fighting with an arm behind their back. It didn't really seem fair. In May of 2024, that restriction was lifted. They were able to attack onto Russian soil, again, only at military targets, and the Russians had to pull back and less innocent civilians died. Again, that was another red line that Putin had, and another red line that I'm sure that Joe Rogan would have just easily given the Russians if he was in control. There's more red lines here. We have incursion into Russian territory. This one was a big red line that Putin laid out, and he was serious about this one. It was no F-16s in Ukraine. There are now F-16s in Ukraine. Nothing happened. Putin didn't do anything because he's a quivering little pussy-ass bitch. And now we have this whole long-range missile systems deeper into Russia red line that Joe Rogan is so terrified that we crossed, so terrified he was able to tell Zelensky to go fuck himself, as well as dying old Joe Biden. Again, I don't understand what's different about this red line as opposed to the dozens of other red lines that the Ukrainians and NATO have crossed apparently, other than the fact that it seems that Putin knows that any kind of escalation on his end won't be treated with the rest of the world right. It's so weird how these people are such simps for Putin. And anything that Putin says they believe, especially when it comes to his red lines, are just words, just bluster, just more saber rattling. And for some reason, simpletons like Joe Rogan are able to use their 5 brain cells to rub it together and come out with exactly what Vladimir Putin wants them to say. It's really strange.
Russia fired a missile today.
I feel
Yeah,
like
they fired an intercontinental ballistic missile for the first time ever. It's the first time one of those has ever been used.
that's insanity.
It's fucking insanity because those intercontinental ballistic missiles can have nukes on them. This one didn't, but if it does, the whole world changes, and it changes because of the military-industrial complex, and it changes because of the money that's going to Ukraine, and it changes because the outgoing president or whoever the fuck is actually running the country has decided to do something fucking insane.
Yeah, that's
Fucking
outrageous.
insane.
Maybe, but just maybe. Now, this is just a crazy fucking thought I have, so I don't know. I might be fucking retarded. But maybe the crazy thing was that Russia used the ICBM at all. Maybe the crazy thing wasn't us using ATACMS. It was how the Russians decided to respond to it. Like you said, it was the first time that anyone's ever used an ICBM offensively in war. And the crazy fucked up people are Zelensky and Biden? Or, like you said, whoever's running the government? Will that person still be running the government when Trump's there? Again, I don't think you're bright enough to understand this, but I'm just trying to help you out just a little bit, all right? So, why are we mad at the people that got attacked? Why are we mad at the victims of the ICBM strike instead of the perpetrators of it? Can you give me another example of an event like this happening where you would act in the same way or blame the same side? I know you're not going to hear this, but I'm speaking to you. I'm speaking to your soul. You can hear me. You can hear me inside that sensory deprivation tank. You hear my voice. What's going on, Joe? Help me understand. I don't think people are cheering on the fact that Russia launched ICBM rockets. I think people are cheering on that the United States government and NATO have finally allowed Ukraine to properly defend themselves. And Joe Rogan should understand this more than anybody as a former fighter, right? How many UFC competitions and fights has Joe commented on? Would he be saying if everything was fair and right and balanced if one of those fighters had an arm tied behind their back? Let's say if one fighter was allowed to kick and the other one wasn't. or one fighter was able to fight and grapple while the other one could only throw punches. Would Joe think that fight is fair? But for some reason, for Joe, when it's finally the poor Russians getting a taste of their own medicine, that just fucking blows his mind. He can't handle that. He thinks it's so fucked up that we allowed the Ukrainians to finally fight on the same playing field. I don't get it.
And we're all sitting there watching it, and people are cheering it on. CNN was saying, like, finally. See what their headline was about Zelensky about Biden giving Zelensky the ability to use long-range missiles. U.S. made long-range. It's not like nobody knows where they came from. It's not like nobody knows we've been funding this. It's a proxy war. The whole thing is fucking insane.
Hey, Joe. Question. If I was to go through your old shows, just dating back 2 years, not even 2 years, how about 1 year? If I went back a year and went through all your shows, how many times would I hear you complaining and giving the same pushback and showing the same amount of anger towards Putin for using North Korean-made weapons or Iranian-made weapons? I mean, the Shahed drones that Russia is launching into Ukrainian civilian population centers, they're made in Iran. Did you have the same energy when Russia was using Iranian-made weapons or North Korean-made weapons?
Come to the negotiation table. Sit down. Work this out. Stop killing everybody.
Again, I don't understand why it's all on the West or all on Ukraine in Joe's mind. You know what would end this war tomorrow? It's the same thing if you look at Israel-Palestine, and the same thing that I think Joe has said in the past. If Hamas put their weapons down tomorrow, I believe Israel would have left Gaza by now. Now, I don't know what would happen in 2 or 3 years. I don't know if they would still try and do some fucky shit inside the West Bank, but if Hamas, all of them, gave up, put their weapons down, I think it would be impossible for Israel to continue the war, especially on the world stage. I don't think anybody could realistically stay on the Israeli side if somehow the armed combatants they were fighting against all gave up. They would look fucking insane. And the same thing here. If Russia was to leave Ukrainian territory today, the war would be over tomorrow. For some reason, in Joe's mind, it's on the victim to lead the negotiation, go on the negotiation table. There's been a lot of bluster coming out of Russia on saying all these red lines on do this, don't do that, but I haven't really heard much about, how to get to the negotiation table for peace. Like, you leave Ukraine, you have peace. It's as simple as that.
How has the left gone so far crazy that they think it's a good thing to launch missiles?
I can tell you exactly why, Joe. It's actually pretty fucking simple. If you actually took 5 minutes to think about this, outside of your bubble of conservative right think, you might understand why. Now, listen, I think liberals and people on the left think it's a good thing when a country is allowed to defend themselves against invasion and subjugation. That's it. That's literally the end of it. I don't understand why you think this is such a crazy thing. I'll toss the question right back at you, Joe. Why do people on the right all of a sudden think it's okay for one country to invade and annex the land of their neighbor?
That's what's scary about life is like you don't want to pay attention to that shit. You just want to live your life. You want to just be carefree and have fun and do the thing that you're passionate about.
Oh, you just want to live your life, Joe? You just want to be carefree, Joe? Kind of like how the Ukrainians want to live their lives like they did before February 2022 when Russia invaded? Like, how can Joe say that in one sentence, yet 2 sentences before that complain about, I don't understand why this is a good thing that we're allowing Ukraine to defend themselves. They're two diametrically opposed positions spoken so closely to each other from the same person. Like, it's examples like this that make it seem like this is bad faith from Joe.
Just hope Putin understands what's going on as well, and Zelensky doesn't do anything stupid, but saying that Putin's terrified.
This might be a controversial take, but I think that person should be terrified. You should be terrified of the consequences of those actions. Any person, any world leader that invades a sovereign country in order to annex and steal part of their land, and they steal children from that country into their own. Now, someone like Joe here, and people who think like him, and people on the show, the president-elect, they might not think that way. They might think that you should be able to just do that and just whatever, but that's not the world I want to live in. And for the group of people that suddenly talk about peace and no war so much, it's super, super fascinating to me that these guys in one breath will say, no war should be allowed, but in the same breath give so much deference to the violent, acting, invading party in this conflict. Really makes you think, huh? Really makes you think where their alliances are.